War and Germany. Name a more iconic duo. But was Germany actually any good at them? Sure, the Prussians were famed for their military, but what have the Germans really accomplished besides losing both major world wars? Do the Germans truly live up to their reputation of being the military masters of Europe? Let's find out today. We start our story in 1618 with the founding of Brandenburg Prussia, the predecessor to Germany. I would have liked to start the video a little bit earlier with the Margraviate of Brandenburg, but it was impossible to find information on most of the wars I discovered, and making any coherent list became increasingly difficult. Besides, starting with Prussia allows us to start right off with one of the most influential wars of the era, the 30 Years' War. For 30 years, Germany was essentially set on fire, and Brandenburg was right in the middle of the conflict. As the Protestants and imperial forces were fighting, Sweden got involved, rampaging around northern Germany to prevent the Habsburgs from defeating the Protestant lords. And when Sweden started to falter, the French got involved as well. During this entire ordeal, Brandenburg lost anywhere between 30 and 50% of their population, which is absolutely devastating. Still, by the end of the conflict, Brandenburg had secured control over eastern Pomerania, which would be absolutely crucial to connect Brandenburg to Prussia via the sea. The Second Northern War would then erupt between Russia, Sweden and Poland. Brandenburg would first join Sweden in their efforts against the Poles, participating in the Swedish capture of Warsaw and gaining some minor territories from Poland. But then, the tide started to turn in favor of the Poles and Brandenburg became interested in switching sides. Here, it's important to understand a quirk of the Brandenburg-Polish relationship. Despite the Elector of Brandenburg also ruling over Prussia, Prussia was still a subject of Poland. But now, in exchange for Brandenburg switching sides, Prussia would become fully sovereign. By the end of this war, Prussia was not only independent from Poland, Brandenburg had now established themselves as a capable regional power which could influence the wars in the region. Then, the French and the English were getting sick of the Dutch being so rich and successful on the world stage, and decided it was time to end this. In an unholy alliance, both states, as well as some German miners, attacked the Dutch Republic. Brandenburg would intervene on the side of the Dutch, but this would lead to France convincing Sweden to invade from Pomerania. Sweden's initial invasion would fail, but then Denmark-Norway would launch an invasion of southern Sweden as well, splitting their forces. By the end of the conflict, Brandenburg would gain some minor territories in Swedish Pomerania. Phew, those wars were quite high intensity for Brandenburg. It's time to cool off a bit. In the Brandenburgische Kapital...
What? What was that? Huh?
Krieg, the Brandenburgian hijack war, Brandenburg had sent out privateers to capture loot and ships. Initially, they had some successes, but eventually, a Spanish fleet inflicted a mild defeat, and with international pressure mounting against Brandenburg, they stopped their raiding entirely. But in the west, France, under Louis XIV, had been acting up in a major way. He had destroyed the Dutch as a great power, massively expanded his state, and France was now definitively the most powerful state in Europe. Fears of future French expansion would spark William of Orange, King of England, as well as the Stadtholder of the Netherlands, to build a grand alliance against the French. Brandenburg initially had an alliance with France, mainly due to French bribery, but a French invasion of the Rhineland would unite North Germany against the French. By the end of the war, France would restore significant territories to Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. To help out their French allies, the Turks had started a simultaneous war against the Habsburgs. It's a very fascinating war, but Brandenburg was barely involved, only sending a couple forces to help the Emperor besiege Buda in Hungary. But we now reach the final war where I say Brandenburg instead of Prussia, as the War of the Spanish Succession broke out. The Habsburgs, intimately concerned with the future of the Spanish lands, sought all the support they could get. Now it just so happens that there is one thing that the Lord of Brandenburg had always wanted: the title of king. Elevating the title of Brandenburg to the position of kingdom within the Holy Roman Empire was politically difficult. So instead, the Hohenzollern would be allowed to elevate Prussia to a kingdom and style themselves as king in Prussia. Do note the king in Prussia, not of Prussia. This was a deliberate naming choice to make the elevation more acceptable to the other states of the empire as well as Poland, who still held West Prussia themselves. In exchange for the Habsburgs accepting and supporting this Prussian move, the Prussians would back the Austrians in the war. The overall war was a draw, with both sides gaining and losing some stuff, but for Prussia, who didn't really care much about the future of the Spanish territories, it was a resounding victory. But the following war is one that Prussia is much more intimately involved with, the Great Northern War. For centuries, the Swedes had been the great power of the Baltic Sea, but now just about all of their neighbors had enough of them. Initially, Prussia was neutral, while Sweden invaded and conquered most of Poland. But then, the Swedes embarked on an ambitious campaign into the Ruthenian steppes, leading to their routing and Sweden losing control over most of their non-Scandinavian territories. As Sweden was already clearly on the back foot, even losing Finland, Prussia would enter the war as well to invade Swedish Pomerania. In a peace deal, Swedish lands in Pomerania would once again be reduced. But up to this point, Prussia had been operating as a regional power at best. But in the next string of conflict, it was about time to beef them up to the status of great power. How? By the power of the patriarchy, of course. Maria Theresa had succeeded her father to the Habsburg lands, but this caused controversy. Could women even rule the Habsburg lands? Realistically, nobody cared. But it did provide the perfect opportunity for Prussia to stake a claim to the very rich Silesian province. Seeing Prussia's success, France and Bavaria also jumped on the bandwagon before it exploded into a European-wide war. By the end of the conflict, very few territories had actually changed hands, with the very notable exception of Prussian control over Silesia being affirmed. But this control would pretty much immediately be questioned as soon after the 7 Years' War would erupt, where Austria would ally with France, hoping to regain the territory. Worryingly, the Russians would also side with the Austrians, and while Britain was on the Prussian side, even the military genius of Frederick the Great couldn't save Prussia from being on the back foot. It seems like Prussia's dream of great power status would be dashed here, as Russia hoped to take Prussia and Austria wanted to take Silesia. But during this war, two miracles of the House of Brandenburg happened. The first was the failure of the coalition to fully destroy the Prussian army after the Battle of Kunersdorf. This meant that Prussia could keep the war going. But still, by 1762, Prussia was just about ready to throw in the towel. But then, the Tsarina of Russia, Elizabeth, passed away. Her successor, Peter, was a great admirer of Prussia and Frederick the Great, and thus not only removed Prussia from the war, he even offered Prussia some forces, allowing the Prussians to keep the Austrians off for the rest of the war and leave the conflict with all of their territory intact. The next one isn't necessarily a full war, as we have the first partition of Poland. The partition came about after the increased tension between Russia and Austria following Russia's conquest of southern Ukraine. Austria felt that Russia was growing too fast and too powerful and wanted compensation as well. To prevent war between the two sides, Prussia came up with a great idea. Why don't we just partition Poland between our three nations instead? With Poland weak, practically being a Russian protectorate, while also being involved in a civil war with the Bar Confederation, the three powers justified their land grabs as restoring order. Thus, Prussia finally gained Western Prussia, unifying their domains. Then a minor war with major potential consequences, the War of the Bavarian Succession. The Habsburgs had seen their influence over the Holy Roman Empire diminish year on year, and they were getting sick and tired of it. Their idea to fix it? Acquire more German lands. Luckily, they had a perfect opportunity when the Lords of Brandenburg died out. Adding Bavaria to the Habsburgs' domains would bolster their hold over southern Germany, and through Bohemia and Bavaria, give the Habsburgs 2 votes for emperorship. But Saxony and Prussia would back the other contenders for the Bavarian throne, intervening to prevent this massive rise in Habsburg power. In the end, all sides decided that the matter was not worth a full conflict, and the dispute was resolved diplomatically. A couple of decades later, Prussia and Russia would come in for seconds, carving up the Polish lands even further. This time, Russia annexed an insane amount of territory in the east, while the Prussians gained territory in Posen. In total, Poland lost more than half of its remaining population in this partition. But we're not done yet, as a couple of years later is the third Polish partition. Within the small remains of Poland, discontent festered, and the Russians were getting sick and tired of allowing the facade of Polish independence to continue. So, the three powers surrounding Poland met up and decided on a final partition of the nation, with Poland being wiped off the map completely and Prussia pushing all the way to Warsaw. But we are now entering the time of the liberal revolutions, and one revolution that I bet most of you aren't familiar with is the Dutch Revolution. The Dutch, once a great power, had declined greatly and were now in an economic recession. Their stadholder, the military leader of the republic, was increasingly acting more authoritarian, and so, influenced by the Enlightenment, the Dutch Patriots were founded, hoping to overthrow the republic and replace it with a more liberal model. A war broke out between the Patriots and the Orangists loyal to the stadholder. But when the Patriots started winning, the Orangists appealed to the Prussians for help. Stadholder Willem happened to be married to Wilhelmina of Prussia, so the King of Prussia was more than happy to intervene and restore order in the Netherlands. But this restoration would only be of short duration, because at the same time, the French Revolution was kicking off. Prussia joined the first coalition against the French, but was amongst the first to leave the war after the French launched a devastating invasion of the Rhineland and the Lowlands. In a secret treaty, Prussia recognized the French gains, and Prussia would remain on the sidelines for the next couple of coalitions. Did that mean that the Prussians weren't doing anything? Not quite. They had joined in the League of Armed Neutrality with Russia, Denmark and Sweden. This club wasn't really successful, as Britain sailed up to Copenhagen and devastated the Danes. In retaliation, the Prussians invaded Hanover, but little came of this and the League disbanded soon after. Then for the war with the Third Coalition, which Prussia didn't get involved in, but is still very important for context. The French invaded Central Europe and brutally smashed the armies of the coalition, especially at the Battle of Austerlitz. In the peace deal, the French created the Confederation of the Rhine, with Napoleon styling himself as the protector of these German states. As a result, the Holy Roman Empire was greatly reduced and afterwards abandoned. During this war, the French also gave control over Hanover to the Prussians. Still, this gift did little to ease the mind of the Prussian monarch, who was increasingly weary of French domination. Spurred on by his wife, he would involve Prussia in the War of the Fourth Coalition, which would prove to be a fatal mistake. Prussia lost battle after battle to Napoleon, and by the end of the conflict had lost most of their western holdings, while the French had also created the Duchy of Warsaw from Prussia's Polish holdings. Both Prussia and Russia were also pressured into joining the continental system, putting an embargo on the British and becoming reluctant French allies. This would mean that Prussian forces also engaged in combat with the Russians during Napoleon's Great Invasion, though with very little enthusiasm. After the French reached Moscow and started to retreat and face massive losses, the Prussians began considering switching sides again. This would soon lead to the formation of the Sixth Coalition, where the tides finally turned for Napoleon. The losses suffered in Russia were unreplaceable, and their enemies were pushing on all flanks. Soon, the coalition reached the Rhine before marching even further and fully capitulating the French. Napoleon would be exiled to Elba, and peace would be restored in Europe. But this peace would be short-lived, as Napoleon soon came back, seized power in France again, and started the War of the Seventh Coalition. This time, the coalition didn't even declare war on France, they declared war on Napoleon specifically. Prussia would be involved in the Battle of Waterloo, where Napoleon was decisively defeated, and this time exiled all the way to St. Helena, never to be seen again. In the peace deal wrapping up the Prussian wars, Prussia would lose some of their previous Polish territories to Russia, but be compensated with massive gains in the Rhineland and Saxony. Sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with the 2 videos I release every single week, consider doing so. Thank you. After the Congress of Vienna, Prussia was pretty peaceful for 3 decades, building up their industry and army, and finally pushing themselves to become the 5th great power of Europe. Still the weakest in terms of the great powers, but certainly a great power. But Napoleon's liberal thought had spread into Europe, and the Napoleonic Wars had awoken feelings of nationalism across the continent, most notably in Germany. This would explode in the revolution year of 1848, where Austria would face massive difficulties with a war in Italy and a revolt in Hungary, so it was Prussia that played the biggest role in suppressing revolts across Germany. And one of these revolts took place in Schleswig-Holstein, controlled by Denmark, hoping to remove the Danes from power in the region. Prussia would intervene to support the rebels, leading to a 3-year war in the peninsula. But eventually, Denmark gained the support of Russia, Britain and France, and so Prussia had to back down on the issue. But not for long, as in 1864 the Danes faced a succession crisis, which extended into their German holdings. The German holdings had been held in personal union, but with a lot of autonomy. With the passing of a new constitution though, this autonomy was somewhat eroded, which was unacceptable to the German Confederation. So, Prussia and Austria allied to take care of the issue, invading and devastating Denmark, taking joint control over the region. But Prussia wasn't done. This was just a stepping stone in Bismarck's 3-step plan to unite Germany. Next up, break Austria's hold over the minor German states. This would be done by fabricating a casus belli over the jointly occupied territories. In only 7 weeks, the seemingly smaller Prussia completely destroyed Austria and their German allies, assisted somewhat by Italy. After the war, Prussia took nothing from Austria directly, but annexed many of the German states that had aligned themselves with the Austrians, while also forming the North German Confederation with the others, uniting much of northern Germany. Now, all the Prussians needed to do was convince the southern states, who were now in limbo with an uncertain future. By painting France as an expansionist power, the southern states would increasingly fall into Prussia's orbit before Bismarck, in a stroke of genius, fabricated a war with France in such a way that the French actually declared war on Prussia. Through a defensive pact, the southern German states joined Prussia, and after their victory, nationalistic feelings had reached such an overload, the southern German states would back the Prussian king in declaring the German Empire. This finally ends the era of Brandenburg Prussia and starts the era of the German Empire. But were the Prussians successful in war? Well, unsurprisingly, the answer is very much yes. 75% of their wars were victories, with only 8% being defeats. 17% were draws. Given a score of 3 to victories, 0 to defeats, and 1 to draws, Prussia ends up with a nice score of 2.42, only barely staying behind the Americans. Now we need to move on to the absolutely disappointing military record of the German Empire. Why disappointing? Because very few interesting conflicts occur in this period. So we will really speedrun most of these. Let's start with Germany's Pacific Wars. The first is the Nauruan Civil War, where the two sides fought each other until Germany came in to end the war and colonize the island while they were at it. Then there's the Samoan Civil War, a complicated affair where Britain, Germany and the US faced off supporting different factions. But when a storm destroyed some Western ships, they decided to compromise and there was no real clear victor. A couple of years later, the second Samoan Civil War would break out, where once again the 3 powers faced off. This time, the island would be partitioned between the US and Germany. As the final Pacific War, there is the Sockaz Rebellion, a very minor conflict where the German administration of an island was attacked and killed before the German Navy arrived to restore order. Over in China though, there was one interesting conflict that Germany participated in, the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxer Rebellion had risen up in the Qing, opposing Western domination over the state. To protect Western interests, a coalition of 8 nations invaded the Qing. Soon, Beijing was under foreign occupation and the Qing were forced to sign a humiliating peace deal, getting a massive debt burden put on them and having to further open up the nation to Western demands, with Germany gaining a sphere of influence over the Shandong Peninsula. But that's enough of the important conflicts for now. Let's dive back into the exciting colonial wars. Germany was a major participant in the scramble for Africa, and this is where we find by far most of their conflicts. The first is the Abu Shiri revolt, which revolted against the rule of the German East Africa Company. The army would smash the revolt and take charge of the region. Also in Tanzania, the Hehe people fiercely resisted German colonization, and it took a 7-year campaign for the Germans to put this down. On the other side of the continent, the Germans were moving into Cameroon. There, they encountered the Fon of Bafut, which would struggle for a whopping 16 years against the colonizers before finally being pacified. The Amadawa Wars in the same region were joint military actions by the Germans and the British against the Sokoto Caliphate and other minor states in the region. It would take almost a decade, but eventually Germany would consolidate their colonial rule. Moving across the Atlantic for a while, we have the Venezuelan crisis. To force Venezuela to pay their debts, Italy, Germany, and the British sent warships to placate the small state into submission. Soon, a compromise would be reached over the debt payments, where the blockading states would increasingly force preferential treatment over the small Latin American state. But back to Africa, the Germans faced a minor uprising in Namibia, the Kavango Uprising. It would be smashed down within a year. But much more devastating were the Herero Wars in Namibia. Some German settlers in the colony were killed, and the army was sent in to restore order by dispersing the rebels. The army would go much further. An order would be made to kill every male Herero and drive the women and the children into the desert. When Berlin learned of this order, they immediately repealed it, but the army initially ignored Berlin. When the army finally stopped this rampant murder, they would continue to gather Hereros and Nama people into concentration camps. In total, anywhere between 30,000 and 100,000 people had died. The Maji Maji rebellion in East Africa would attempt to drive out the German colonizers, and in response, the Germans induced a famine through brutal, scorched earth tactics, causing anywhere between 100 and 300,000 Africans to die. Another brutal stain on Germany's colonial record. Now it's time for the second, truly important war which the German Empire participated in, the First World War. Started due to clashing imperial ambitions and growing alliances, the final drop in the bucket was the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. Germany would give Austria a blank check to do whatever they deemed fit to do with Serbia, which was war. Russia supported Austria, France supported Russia, Germany attacked France through Belgium, Britain got involved, and bam, World War. In the West, Germany would almost take Paris, but fail, and the front line would stalemate. In the East, Germany would perform much better, but it would still take a revolution to fully end this front line, giving Germany control over much of Eastern Europe. This wouldn't last for too long though, as America had entered the war, and after a desperate final push on the Western Front, it became clear that Germany couldn't win, their allies were collapsing, and the German government fell. This ends the German Empire as Wilhelm flees into the Netherlands. Now, making a list of their war score almost feels like cheating, since they had so few real wars. But let's do it anyway. The Empire won 71% of their wars, lost 7%, and drew 21%. This gives them a war score of 2.36, which very satisfyingly means that they don't beat the Prussians. The next German government would form a democratic regime and become known as Weimar Germany. Within 3 years, they would face a whopping 6 conflicts. The first was the German Revolution, where during the fall of the empire, communists, socialists, conservatives, and liberals all vied for power. The communists specifically rose up against the government, hoping to create a socialist republic, but the army and right-wing Freikorps militias would quell these revolts. Around the same time, the Poles rose up in Posen, splitting the territory from the German Empire, even before the Treaty of Versailles was finalized. In Silesia, the Poles weren't as successful initially, as the Germans crushed a similar revolt. Over in the Ruhr region, the communist Red Army once again attempted to install communism into the nation, and they would once again be beat down by German forces. Then, in 1920, a German newspaper accidentally printed a false report that Warsaw had fallen to the communists. This led to Germans in Silesia organizing a march celebrating the end of an independent Poland, with the Germans looting Polish shops. In response, the Poles rose up in the region as well, occupying government officers. By this point, the region was under Entente military occupation, and it would take Entente forces to restore order. In the third and final Silesian uprising, the Poles once again rose up, as it became clear that the Entente wouldn't grant Eastern Silesia to Poland. Again, the Entente would break the revolt, and the borders of Silesia were finalized in the Treaty of Versailles. And that's already the end of the short but turbulent string of Weimar internal conflicts. They won 50% of their conflicts, lost 17%, and 33% had to be solved and dictated by outside powers, thus counting as draws. This gives the Weimar Republic a final score of 1.83. But after these initial conflicts, the Weimar Republic would be peaceful for 2 decades until the ultra-nationalists gained power. They would only engage in 2 conflicts. The first is the Spanish Civil War, where German forces would assist the Spanish in a massive way, especially through their air force, securing victory for Francisco Franco. The only other conflict the Germans engaged in during this period was the Second World War. Sure, they had some expansions beforehand, but these were all largely bloodless annexations. World War II would start with a German invasion of Poland, which France and Britain would oppose. In the next year, Germany would defeat Poland, invade Scandinavia, and then strike down the Benelux into France. All of Europe under German control, they turned east and conquered a significant part of the Soviet Union. But this would be the peak of German success. The German alliance failed in Africa, Japan had caused the Americans to get involved in the war, and after a devastating defeat at Stalingrad, the Germans were now on the back foot in Europe too. From here, Germany lost all initiative, and slowly, but steadily, the combined Allied armies from the east, south and west would close in on Germany, causing their defeat and occupation by the Allied powers. This ends the era of the no-no Germans. They had 2 wars, one they won, one they lost, giving them an easy score of 1.5 at the bottom of the list. But now Germany splits in 2, West Germany and East Germany. Luckily, this doesn't actually complicate our story, because both sides barely involved themselves in conflict. After World War II, practically nobody, including the Germans themselves, wanted Germany to be a strong military power anymore. So, during the Cold War, West Germany had a whopping 0 wars, and East Germany had 1 minor internal conflict. That one conflict was the East German Uprising of 1953, where anti-communist elements rose up against the Soviet-installed puppet regime. With Soviet help, this rebellion would be beat back. And that's it for East Germany. With a whopping 100% win rate, they have officially the best military record of all the nations in history. Of course, I'm just kidding, we aren't really going to count them. But after this, the Cold War ends and Germany reunifies under the West. Carefully, the Germans would start to get involved in outside conflicts again. The first would be Operation Deliberate Force, where Germany joined NATO in intervening in Bosnia, forcing a ceasefire and negotiating an end to the fighting. A couple of years later, Germany would again join NATO by intervening in Kosovo, by bombing Serbia into the ground until they retreated, causing de facto Kosovar independence to this very day. Next, terrorists destroyed the Twin Towers, and in retaliation, America entered Afghanistan to get them out and turn Afghanistan into a democracy while they were there anyways. In a brutal 20-year conflict, which Germany had joined as well, the US would fail and have to retreat, giving the entire nation back to the Taliban. In an ongoing conflict, Germany would again join a US operation into the Middle East, this time into Syria and Iraq against ISIL. While the war is still ongoing, ISIL has lost most of their territory in Syria and all of it in Iraq, and it's looking very likely that the coalition will achieve victory. As the final peacekeeping operation Germany joined, there is the Mali War. Again, Germany joined to fight terrorism in the region. This operation wasn't necessarily a failure or a success, as in 2023, the government of Mali requested foreign fighters to get out, which they then did. And that's it. Those are the wars of Germany from Brandenburg, Prussia to today. How did modern Germany do? Well, with our small sample of 5 wars, one of which is still ongoing and won't be counted further, pretty bad. They won 50% of their wars and drew and lost 25% respectively. This brings us to a total score of 1.75 between no-no Germany and the Weimar Republic. But in terms of Germany as a whole, we have seen 15 won total wars, 2% of which are ongoing and thus disregarded. 69% of the wars were won, 12% were lost, and 20% were draws. This gives Germany a final score of 2.25, placing them between America and Russia in second place. But that's it for this video. Let me know which nation you'd like to see us